Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones. The unvisited ones. The cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome to the show Stephe Barber. Stephen is a novelist, non-fiction author, and professor of art and film at Kingston University. Stephen joins us today to talk about one of the most enigmatic figures in European theatre and the avant-garde, Antonin Artaud. And he joins us to talk specifically about Heliogabalus, or the Crowned Anarchist, a work by Artaud based on the notorious teenage emperor whose 2-year reign was apparently nothing but a chaotic orgy of sex and blood. If you're unfamiliar with Artaud, there is a brief video from PBS in the show notes describing his impact on the theatre that is actually a lot better than I expected. But you don't need any background info for this, which is an excellent chat. Oh, and one last thing. This was recorded before I found out the mic and software were capturing too much room sound, which I think I mentioned last time. So this episode still has that minor inconvenience, but the good news is it is solved moving forward. Let's do it.
Stephen, welcome aboard.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon. Thank you.
All right, so we have a traditional first question for first-time guests on the show, but I'm going to have to modify it a little bit for the topic under discussion. And so the modified traditional first question, Stephen, is, was Antonin Artaud a weird kid?
Yeah, he was weird after a few years, I think. He had very severe meningitis, I guess when he was about 5 or 6 years old. And after that, he got seriously weird and spent much of his early life in sanatoria, but mostly luxurious sanatoria in Switzerland and so on. So however weird he was well looked after during that era.
Did he ever, as far as you're aware, locate almost like the source? Did he have a theory as to his, subsequent mental problems throughout his life, or whatever we want to call them now versus then? Because it's sort of problematic to use terms like madness anymore. But did he ever think maybe some of those challenges originated with ill health in childhood, or would he have like a more cosmic idea of it? Do you think?
Yeah, and also, social conception of it as well, in the sense that Artaud is extremely antisocial and has a very negative view of society in really a multiplicity of ways. And so it's more a question of trigger points of anger, rage, opposition, frustration, exasperation that I think, he would see as, his own variant of madness. And, often during, Artaud spent, I think, 9 years in lunatic asylums in France from the 1930s to the 1940s. And, he was very, very conscious of the fact that, he was diagnosed with a whole set of psychoses, and he knew all about them, and he was very conscious of his own conception of madness as a way of detonating those kind of social definitions of madness.
Yeah, it's all sort of stitched in there. I find it really interesting that he had, I think it was Lacan or someone, whoever that Dr. L was, who said he'd never write again, and that was sort of 20 books before the end of his life, or 20 publications before the end of his life. So that there's a sort of fascinating nested comment about how we see the mind and mental health that can kind of only come from someone like him, which is also a comment on the uses and limitations of mental health treatment, and how hopefully at least in some way it's improved since giving someone electric shock therapy when they show up destitute from Ireland towards the end of their life. Like it's the most fascinating example's the wrong word. It's just like the most fascinating story of how hopefully how hopefully our understanding of mental health has improved, but definitely from a very low base in some of his cases.
Yeah, a very big problem for Artaud was that this period that he was interned in psychiatric clinics in France was during the era of the Second World War. And so this made physical conditions really very urgent alongside the treatments that he was subjected to in those clinics. And so he began in 1940-41, years in an asylum called Ville-Everard to the east of Paris, where starvation was really widespread in the asylum. And, there were particular years, in the first years of the German occupation, when half of the asylum inmates died in one particular year. And it was only by his transfer to the then unoccupied zone of France in 1943 that he was able to survive.
And it's the most amazing story. But I think we should probably, it's my fault, we should move back chronologically. How does this kid get from Swiss sanatoria to Paris? Like what happened to him for him to show up at a young age? I mean, it's definitely at that time the city you go to. Was it as simple as that, or was it something else that led to him showing up when he did?
It's partly through his desire to be a film actor as well as a theatre actor. And he had members of his family who were film producers and so on. So immediately, Artaud got to a certain age and was, I think, about 24 years old, and decided that he would leave Marseille, which was the city where his family lived, and travel to Paris. So he was immediately given film roles, and within a few years had become quite a well-known film actor in France. Appeared in films in the mid 1920s with Abel Gance and Carl Dreyer, and had quite a prominence as a film actor. And it was only partly through his simultaneous preoccupations with other art forms like theatre and visual arts, and at the same time, drug addictions, that he never got to be this very prominent film actor, which I think in the mid-20s people really expected him to become.
Well, that was going to be the next question, which is how did not necessarily what went wrong, but where was the step change in his life there? And as you say, a big part of it was that lifelong addiction, which is another thing he struggled with. Was there anything else in the kind of, did he get sick of it? I know I've read from memory, like I learned about him in the context of a film course, so this is the part that I remember. He was far more prominent in silent films before the arrival of the talkies. And was there a technological reason for that move, or was that just one of those weird coinciding things? His film career ends about 1935. So he goes right from the period of silent films, experimental silent films that he'd made from about 1920 onwards with directors like Claude Autant-Lara, to the mid 30s when he was still appearing in Abel Gance's films. So he has quite a sudden end to his film career when he decided that he would travel to Mexico in 1935 and managed to get some funding from the French and Mexican governments to travel to Mexico to take peyote with the Tarahumara peoples. At least that was his intention. And he wrote a book about his experiences with the Tarahumaras, and describes his participation in peyote rituals, peyote dances. But in recent years, it's more or less been established that he made the whole thing up. And that although he did travel to the Tarahumara lands, he was at the wrong
part of the year for the peyote rituals. And so he had to fabricate it in the way that during the same era he used to fabricate other travel narratives, for example, to the Galapagos Islands. And so it seems that, although he's very well known for this experiences of peyote, it seems to have been completely invented.
Wow, that is something I did not know. That's definitely, when you say in the last few years, it's in the 20 or so years since I was at university, because I definitely had questions about that. That's amazing. Do you think, okay, I'll modify this question. So he definitely went to Mexico, and whether or not, and I remember this being not a really good strategic choice career-wise, but do you think he actually took peyote at all when he was there? I mean, because you could, even if it's outside ceremony season, you could presumably, like, I'm just wondering, did Artaud, wherever he was holed up in Mexico, figure, well, I better take some of this stuff anyway, and I can fabricate the rest of it? Or do you think it's completely made up, and he didn't even have peyote when he was there?
Yeah, it does seem as though this is anthropological research that has been done in recent years about the time of year that Artaud was there, and the period was one when anthropologists, scientists would go to the Tarahumara lands, especially to the village of Noragachic, which is where Artaud headed for, and it does seem that he didn't take peyote.
Amazing.
And one of the very few things that he didn't take, because Paris whatever he could get his hands on, and did to the very end of his life when he was especially a consumer of chloral hydrate.
Wow, gosh. So the tragedy of that is that a lot of those entheogens, less so with peyote, but it would still work. They're quite powerful addiction interrupters. So if he had gone to Mexico and taken it, maybe the rest of his life may not have been so substance dependent. I did not know that. That's really fascinating. So he was around 40-ish when that happened, but we should sort of pull back to, I guess, when he started to get interested in theatre, because the book Under Discussion, which we'll get to, came about at around the same time he was putting together a lot of his thoughts and ideas on what theatre, in his estimation, and I'm in broad agreement with a lot of it, should be. So let's go back to Paris, late 20s. At some stage, he starts doing film and associating with theatre people, or is it film first, then theatre?
Yeah, it's really film first, because he began in filmmaking aspirations. Almost as soon as he started as a film actor, and so he began to write film scripts, film treatments. This was also during the era when he was a member of the Surrealist movement, and then he continued to write these after he'd been expelled from the Surrealist movement. I think in 1926. So he carried on with his aspirations to become a film director until about 1930, 1931. And, he'd done over 20 film scripts by that time, and he was finding it extremely difficult to find the funding to actually take forward his film scripts. One of his film scripts was filmed by the director Germain Dulac as what I guess was the very first surrealist film, The Seashell and the Clergyman. But Artaud himself had a extremely difficult time trying to find the funding for films, just as he also had a excruciating time finding the funding for his theatre experiments. And by the beginning of the 30s, he was getting disillusioned with film. He saw other surrealists or films associated with the surrealists, the work of Buñuel, Cocteau, and was livid and jealous at the same time, because he thought that they'd taken on board a lot of the ideas that he developed over the past 5 years, and so he moved away from film from that time. Still continued to be a film actor until the mid-30s, but his desire to actually make films comes to an end about 1930-31.
So that's the other track, along with his what's the word? I guess his beef with the likes of Breton and the rest, and their growing communist sentiments, which is something you kind of see. You kind of see how that's at odds with his magical or pagan universe that comes through a lot in Heliogabalus. But we should probably talk about that, which is like, what was his beef with communism that led to one of these rifts? Because you did actually see, it wasn't just Breton, but you do see that inevitable French materialism and love of bureaucracy coming through the surrealists, and it has that removal of a magical or pantheistic universe that he kind of liked. Is that the major flashpoint, or is there a bit of professional jealousy, as you just mentioned, that goes along with it?
Yeah, this alliance of the Surrealist movement with the French Communist Party is really, very, very extraordinary and, fractious from the start, because, Surrealism also has, generally its preoccupations with magic. And as the 30s went on, it's the era of the Stalinist show trials and so on. So it's a very kind of brutal manifestation of communism that's taking shape. And so, also, for Breton, it becomes impossible too. So at the end, there's dissolution of these surrealist movements, contact with the Communist Party too. But I think that for Artaud, Artaud never had any it was never attracted by the Communist Party at all, and so really from the very start, he's he has also no alliance with right wing movements either. So he's really in a parallel universe from the political currents of the 1930s in France and more widely in Europe.
Yeah, that's probably important to sort of mention. It actually seems a bit bougie to say that his interests were in many respects more cosmic or metaphysical than political, because that's totally something that today that sounds a bit bougie, right? But he wasn't necessarily alone with that, and there were people. I'm just thinking of sort of L'Étranger's ideas about the people that were kind of influenced by Nietzsche and were aware that in post-death of God, something had to, like, how do you find the magic back in the universe? Because if you don't, you end up with this, mechanized death machine, which is their kind of psychological response to the First World War, and then eventually, as a predictive thing, the Second World War. So it's almost, there is a politics to it, which is which we miss now, which is they're in the wake of Nietzsche's dead God and trying to grapple with that's the rise of death machines and what that means for the universe. Because they're all kind of, I have a question which I think a lot of people ask, which is, well, is he a pagan? Was he Catholic? Was he in some sense, or in what way was he spiritual? Which I think we'll get to now. But like that was a lot more political then than it may be apparent to, or it's differently political now. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, it is. Yeah, and partly Artaud's journeys, as well as the journey to Mexico. He also went to Ireland in 1937, and perhaps the documentation of that journey to Ireland is really in the form of the letters that he wrote. He wrote many letters from this journey, which he conceived as an apocalyptic journey. And before he set off for this journey to Ireland, he had announced in a pamphlet that he wrote that he himself was going to be an agent of the apocalypse, a seminal figure of the apocalypse. And so he was looking for a landscape outside any kind of contamination from these political furores of the 1930s, where he felt that he could in some way have the corporeal connection, spiritual corporeal connection with this with this idea of transmutations, of radical transmutations that would be engulfing, that would involve great violence, and out of that, he himself would have a power which I guess is a kind of Nietzschean power, but it's one which is already fragmented and striated, because he also sees as someone who is always under attack, always being assailed by all of the powers around him.
Yeah, gosh, that's such a good way of describing it. That torment, which is both, this is an oversimplification, but you'll get what I mean, is both in his head and also isn't. Like that is just a sort of, that's a classic response from someone who struggled with mental illness their entire life, but is also kind of true. Well,
yeah, and he was very interested in black magic at this time. And, in one of these letters from Ireland, he says he's going to bring together a great meeting of all the black magicians of that era in order that they will annihilate God. Which I guess, again, is a Nietzschean idea, but it's also a point of desperation where he himself is very isolated, and what happened at the end of this journey to Ireland is that he was arrested in Dublin, imprisoned in Mountjoy prison for a while, then sent down to the port and deported from France. And as soon as he got back to France, he was put in a lunatic asylum.
Yeah, I remember looking at the document that sort of you're being ejected. So, yeah, it's definitely pre-EU, but it's also like you're being ejected, you're an undesirable, France can have you back. And you think, wow, that's not 2019. I mean, in a way it is, but in another sense, that's sort of individualized. No, you are destitute and crazy. And we're going to put you on a boat and you show up and, you end up... What was it, 50-something electroshock treatments he had in the south of France when he got back. So... a little bit more of a brain fry on someone who's mentally ill and has just been homeless. It's the most amazing experience.
Yeah, and he was moved around from asylum to asylum for the first years. So it was actually, I think, about 5 years between when he started to be interned in the end of 1937, and then finally he arrived at the asylum of Rodez, which is in the south of France, south central France, and it's there that Dr. Ferdier and his assistant La Tremolier decided that they were going to try this new treatment of electroshock.
Amazing, yeah. So this is sort of like a no pressure question, Stephen. But if we go back to the conditions in his life and what was going on at the time that he came to write Heliogabalus, we should probably start with, it's intertwined, but we should probably start with what was his critique of theatre going on at the time. And he did write rather a lot about this, which is why it's a no pressure question, but he's sort of at the time, as I understand it, formulating ideas for the theatre and its double, but also is aware that theatre isn't doing the magical things that he wants it to do. So what was his critique of and kind of hope for what theatre could be as a, I would call it a platform, but I remember in university it was more like a lab. But let's talk about what his thoughts, because for people who are unaware who listen to the show, Artaud's most perennial influence, at least, Artaud's deepest, longest influence since his death has been in the performance world. He wrote about you could, you look at Heliogabalus and it's some sort of philosophical comment on history and power and so on. So there's plenty of other reasons to be interested in him as a writer and so on. But his longest lived impact today, I studied him at film school in Sydney, so it's all around the world, is in his understanding of theatre and performance and the capacity of performance to be magically changing of or impactful of its audience. So I guess if we start there and then move into this remarkable little book.
Yes, really, Artaud had a all-engulfing rejection of theatre as it was at the beginning of the 1930s. It's the beginning of the 1930s that he starts a set of manifestos that he eventually published as a book called The Theatre and Its Double. This was a book that was actually published after he'd been interned in a psychiatric hospital. So he was, out of the public arena of theatre by the time that his book on theatre was actually published. And it's a time when he was very desperate. As I mentioned, he'd given up on the idea that he could make films. And all through the 1920s, he'd also been a theatre actor from time to time. And in 1931, he went to the Colonial Exhibition in Paris and saw performances of Balinese dance. And these performances of Balinese dance, which are kind of underpinned by spectral presences, magical presences, unleashed this idea that he could begin a new theatrical experimental form that would be launched in some ways by this experience of Balinese dance. And in the I guess about 15 years ago, the same dancers, or the families of the original dancers performed again in Paris, and it really was a extraordinary, really enthralling performance. So you can kind of have a sense of how deeply it impacted on Artaud's work. So through the first half of the 1930s. He really used the medium of the manifesto to develop these ideas about theatre culture. He was interested still in film, and was especially devoted to the films of the Marx Brothers at this time. So there are elements of Marx Brothers films in there too. And the translation that's been published of Heliogabalus is really charts a moment when he was attempting to take these manifestos into a public space, but was still, in a desperate situation, partly a financially desperate situation. So he was taking commissions to do writing projects. And so this biography of Heliogabalus actually came about as a commission from his publisher of that time, Robert de Noël. And so it was one of several, 2 or 3 commissions which de Noël gave him, which supported Artaud during this period, around 1933-34, when he was trying to transition on from writing manifestos that denounced contemporary theatre culture and attempted to formulate a completely different theatre culture, and to have the resources to actually make a spectacle which would demonstrate his ideas.
And that sort of making of a spectacle, you see, lit up in his understanding of this emperor. But so was it the publisher's idea, or did Artaud see in the story of Heliogabalus a way to get paid to write a book, but also to kind of explore the resonance and potential societal impact of spectacles?
Yeah, it is a commission, and so Artaud himself didn't instigate the book, but as soon as the book was suggested to him by this publisher, Robert de Noël, who was quite a young and adventurous publisher of that era, Artaud decided he was going to take it on, and that he researched in the Bibliothèque Nationale, the National Library in Paris, for 2 or 3 months, and so he read quite a lot of books about magic from that era. In the French edition of this, there's a list of every book that he read. So there's about 3 pages of the titles of the books. So he was mainly there'd been a big engagement with both the Roman emperors and also with magical cultures, especially from the end of the 1880s, 1890s. So Artaud read all of this material while he was preparing Heliogabalus. And the book wasn't written. He made some notes for it, and then, as with many of Artaud's books, he dictated it. And so he improvised his way through the book. So the book is kind of a vocal experiment in a lot of ways.
It's magnificent. The energy of it. As someone who kind of wrote a non-straight history book myself, the format and delivery is astonishing. It's just like breathtaking to deliver a book on kind of the potential of theatre and the return or the need for magic masquerading as a history book. I mean, there's a question then. Is that what the publisher expected, or is this a case of is this almost like Lord of the Rings being a follow-up to a children's book, and then it turns out it's it's a million words in 25 languages, and it doesn't exactly resemble The Hobbit? Did the publisher say, yes, definitely, I want a book on Heliogabalus, and then what he gets is this object that is a book on Heliogabalus, seemingly, but there's a bunch of other stuff as well?
Yeah, I think Robert de Noël knew what he was going to get. He knew he was not going to get a conventional history of, a Roman emperor of the 3rd century AD. He was going to get a very exhausting, exacting, vocally conjured narrative, which reflects at the same time a lot of these theatre manifestos that Artaud had been developing over the past 2 or 3 years. And there are extraordinary stories of Artaud reading parts of the book during the years, during the months that he was developing it, especially an incident where he was in a taxi in Paris and was attempting to inhabit or envision Heliogabalus, and talking about the imminent destruction of the world, or the necessary destruction of the world. So it's really possible to see from the manuscript of Heliogabalus, which is in the Bibliothèque Nationale, that he didn't write more than a skeletal framework for the book, and that it was through these sessions of improvisation, in the form of vocal dictation to a secretary, that the book was created. And that's really the way in which Artaud created a lot of his books right up until the end of his life.
Yeah, and it's funny, like, vocal dictation is it's the correct statement, but it's also, he's writing a book that's masquerading as a history book, but is about performance and anarchy and so on, and he's performing it. So this, what's great about this recent edition is the letters at the back and commentary or observations by people like Aeneas Nin, who basically observing his descent into a deliberate kind of Heliogabalan madness in various cafes and taxis. And it was, so when he's dictating the book, it is a layer of performance about a history of an emperor who has things to say about the impact of performance, and it's stacked in a way that I think is remarkable and definitely comes through. But this is a fraught question about history in general, I guess, to follow up on that, but we have to ask it. And apologies in advance, how historically accurate was the picture of Heliogabalus's life as an emperor, as it was during Artaud's time and also now? Was the publisher aware that the book, it was never going to be a straight history book, but let's just leave it there. Like, how quote-unquote historically accurate, fraught though that is Artaud's account of this emperor?
Yeah, he was asked, one of the letters that I translated for the end of the book, his friend, the magazine editor, Jean Paulhan, asked him, is it true? Is it true? And Artaud is really very candid about the degree to which he has invented Heliogabalus's life. That he says the dates are true, and that a set of events are true. And at that time, I think there had been a lot of research into Heliogabalus's life, not so much in France, but more in Germany in the 1890s, when there's a huge preoccupation with both conducting archaeology and reconstructing lives of the Roman emperors. So Artaud was very candid that he had invented a lot of the material that he came up with, but he says that he wanted to create an atmosphere of panic-strickenness that establishes itself in the book. This is a quotation from this letter that he wrote to Jean Paulhan, which is right at the end of the work, when the book was actually published. So this idea of a panic-strickenness is something that's really at variance with a historical narrative in which the narrative is kept under control, and the historian knows what is coming. The historian has charted it in a set of chapters, which then get filled. It's almost the antithesis of that with Artaud's writing of Heliogabalus, that it's this idea that he would unleash the book. And, so this idea of a panic-strickenness, which he himself, as the author of the book, is experiencing as he's writing the book, and which is necessarily transmitted directly to the reader, too.
It's such useful context because I hadn't read it before, obviously. This is the first time it's been out in its complete form in English, as far as I can tell. It has a layer of reality, or dare I say accuracy, that isn't from a historical book, because you're essentially dealing with a deranged, nepotistic, to the point of weirdly incestual family seizing power and destabilizing the world, and that does seem a little resonant, at the moment, in its own fascinating way. But we should maybe give a couple of paragraphs devotion to what we do in fact know about, various Ata Vespasianus, posthumously known as Heliogabalus. This because there's something. It was, I think, not just Germany, but like the artistic interest in him is the most Freudian Rorschach of a culture at the time, and the Romantics' interest, and it says something about a culture at the time's interest in, or fascination or preoccupation with sex and deviant sexuality at the time, and so on. But we're dealing with essentially a child emperor who's had a 2-year reign, and from there, like as is usually the case with history, the near contemporaneous accounts, of which there's only about 3, are all after his death and are all coming from a very specific moral way. But let's talk about Heliogabalus the person. I mean, how accurate do you think some of the stories are, and what might some of them be?
Well, Artaud gives a really dense account of Heliogabalus's lineage. And so in the first part of the book, he's very, very keen to establish this network of alliances and conflicts, which finally allows Heliogabalus to become emperor very unexpectedly. And Heliogabalus, I think, was 14 when he became emperor. And because he was in what is now Syria, Heliogabalus's palace was in the what is now the city of Homs in Syria. So he had to make a great journey to Rome as a result. So a lot of Artaud's account is devoted to this journey, and it's not a linear journey. And Heliogabalus keeps stopping. He's constantly fascinated by events that he can precipitate during the course of the journey, and so he's making a journey right across the southeastern Europe with his great procession of phallic symbols, and eventually he arrives in Rome, and then Artaud almost pauses the narrative for a while, and discusses the impact of this upstart's arrival in Rome, and his dissolution, dismantling of power within Rome. And then towards the end of the book, it really speeds up, and Artaud is very, very interested in the excess of Heliogabalus. So, it's not only profligate palace orgies and, giving the responsibility to his lovers or to animals for governing the Roman Empire, but it's also this sense of that the dissolution can't be stopped. It acquires a momentum, and so the final pages of Heliogabalus are around the death of Heliogabalus when he was executed through an uprising of soldiers, including his own guards. And Artaud is especially interested in this death of Heliogabalus, that he's thrown into a sewer, he's thrown into the palace excremental pits and so it's this mixing of elements, which is always there in Artaud's evocation of Heliogabalus, of semen, excrement, blood, finally, he puts a lot of emphasis into the way in which then Heliogabalus's body is simply thrown away. It's tossed into the river and abandoned. So it's a narrative which isn't a linear narrative of Heliogabalus's life. It has those moments of really acute intensity, a kind of apocalyptic intensity that is also there in Artaud's letters from Ireland of a few years later.
Do you think that's tied into his, which is a question, like what does he mean by anarchy, both in the book and in his life? Because he says of Heliogabalus, he was a born anarchist and all his acts as king were the acts of a born anarchist, the enemy of public order. But he first practices anarchy on himself and against himself. So is it that upwelling of apocalypticism in the body and then having it kind of wreck the power structures around it? Is that what he, like, was he an anarchist in that sense? If he's an apocalypticist, was he pro-anarchy? Because the subtitle, and I love it just precisely dates it. More books should still be titled something or something, because it's Heliogabalus or the Crowned Anarchist, and I love that that turn of the century stuff. Was he an anarchist, and what did he mean by it? Is anarchy in almost the exclusively negative sense of a uncontrollable force coming to wreck power structures, or did he have nice, I guess, things to say about it as well?
Yeah, well, the 1930s in France is a decade of anarchy and of attempts to weld together anarchy with political power. But Artaud isn't interested in those events of the 1930s. He's really much more taken with historical moments such as the life of Heliogabalus that give him the opportunity to explore a situation in which someone has been given supreme power and then turns it against that power. So for Artaud, I think that there's no anarchy unless there's the holding of a sense of extreme authority, which can then be dismantled. It's a particular variant of anarchism. It's an anarchism that you must first belong to an autocracy, and with the sense that autocracy can then be exploded. So that sense of anarchism is really still there. 10 years or so later in Artaud's work, but then he turns it against supreme institutions of power, like the French psychiatry, the French government of the immediate post-war years. So it is a kind of an enduring anarchy, but it passes through a lot of transmutation during that 10 years or so.
Yeah, and his dissatisfaction with you kind of see not only was anarchy in the air in a pan-European sense, but definitely a French sense, but his particular dissatisfactions at the time that he was writing the book are in that structural sense, and I find that. And is that what the publisher was after? Were they after a anarchist book, or was that just something that Artaud saw in the story of Heliogabalus?
Because Robert de Noël was also very interested in anarchism. I think that it was actually part of his plan that he would incite Artaud to write about a subject matter where he would give a very distinctive vision of anarchism. And Robert de Noël was also the publisher of Céline, of Louis Ferdinand Céline, and Céline's work is really raving anarchism at the same time as having an aura of attraction to totalitarian power with it. So there's a lot of contradiction there. And when I met Artaud's psychiatrist Fedier, he told me he had always been an anarchist when he had been the director of the Rodez Psychiatric Hospital. He'd been a surrealist poet, pornographer, political anarchist, and then through these strange events of the 1930s, he suddenly found himself the director of a psychiatric hospital when he was only about 30 years old, and so he was faced with this question. I'm an anarchist, but now I've become the director of a psychiatric hospital with life or death power over these thousands of insane figures. And so this whole amalgam of anarchism with the strange currents of the 1930s, always generates contradictions, paradoxes, and I think that's part of the fascination of Heliogabalus, that it's a book of extreme contradictions.
Yeah, I like one of the lines in it that Heliogabalus undertook a systematic and joyous demoralization of the Latin mind and consciousness, and Artaud says, and he would have actually pushed that out into the entire Latin world or the entire empire had he lived more than a couple of years before being murdered by his own guards. Like the joyous demoralization, you hear that in the French, and like demoralisation, you get that's the removal of morals rather than our kind of understanding of demoralization being kind of exclusively negative. What he's talking about there is Heliogabalus's this assault. Like why he's so fascinating is that anarchistic wrecking of moral structures, right? That's what was so incandescent about this, teen emperor, surely.
Yes, that's right. I mean, and Heliogabalus was a figure, who fascinated a lot of French writers and artists, during the 1930s. He also appealed to Jean Genet, and Jean Genet, wrote a play about Heliogabalus. I think this is probably several years later, around 1938-39. Genet's work is also, very very much taken with this question of anarchism, criminality, dissolution of state apparatus, and at the same time, this sense that behind it, there's a sense of corporeal extravagance, of unstoppable desire for excess.
Well, that's one of the that sort of embodied anarchism, I think, is one of the things that is a match to Artaud's notions of theatre as a performance being really essentialist. Like, really, it's not a mind-to-mind transfer. It's a impactful bodily experience, because in his kind of evocation of Heliogabalus, he's this 14-year-old who replaces Jupiter with his Syrian sun god and dresses as a woman and performs as a prostitute outside the churches and only hires people close to him based on penis size and all this. Like, it's whether any of that is true, and probably some of it is, to be honest, whether any of that is true, it's this that it is that systematic demoralization. There's no part of it. It must have been the most fascinating, again, like Rorschach mirror of a culture, to look at this couple of years of this teenager just wrecking everything. Like, the potential in that, the creative potential in that is fascinating.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people saw Artaud in the same way in the first half of the 1930s as figure in France's artistic culture that was wrecking everything, that was provoking sometimes literal riots especially in the context of his disputes with the Surrealists, and was using one of the most prominent cultural journals of that era to denounce and call for an erasing of France's theatre culture. So there's a sense of an uproar of someone who is out of control. And with Artaud, it really just happens for those 4 or 5 years, until he himself decided that he was going to leave Paris and head for Mexico. Yes, that sense of a period of tumultuous disintegration of institutions of art or of preferably of government, and that had the potential to unleash things that otherwise wouldn't have been carried through in art culture. And that's part of the reason why Artaud's work became so influential again in the 1960s, when France, especially with the May '68 riots in Paris, became a urban culture of uproar, of riots again.
Yeah, there's few people would argue there's definitely things that need wrecking in how we live. So, and Artaud did. It was definitely not lost on him, and it was, I presume, part of him getting in that performance mode to see the parallels between Heliogabalus and his life at the time. Like, he makes that quite explicit. He's like, in some sense, at least in part, this book is about me, as well as all the other stuff I want it to be about.
Yeah, he's really explicit about that also in the letter that he wrote to the magazine editor Jean Paulhan, and he says very explicitly, "This is a book in which I've also been describing myself." And I think there's no doubt that if Artaud had had the opportunity to make a theatrical spectacle around Heliogabalus, he would have also felt that was a way to expand that sense of an oscillation between the figure of Heliogabalus and his own sense of anarchism and uproar. He had very little opportunity to actually take forward these ideas about performance in the mid-1930s, and again through financial reasons, his inability to convince the producers of theatres, the owners of theatres, that they should give him the theatre to present one of his works, and he had extremely little capacity to take forward these manifestos into theatrical spectacles in Paris at that time.
He didn't make it easy for himself. Scorpions coming out of vaginas and lightning effects and so on are not exactly low budget at the time. You could cheat it with a RP screen now, but it was definitely some ambitious stuff from a staging perspective, not just from a content perspective, which might have made it a little bit extra challenging for him, I think.
Yes, and yes, he really only had one opportunity with this spectacle, the Cenci, in 1935, which was a huge financial failure and closed after a relatively small number of performances, and had only been possible in the first instance because he'd received some funding from an aristocrats, and so it was this sense of being raised from France's contemporary theatre culture of that era, which I think is one of the reasons why he begins to feel that it's the necessary moment for these magical journeys that he had in mind.
That's interesting. Well, that just landed in my head, and I get that now, because the logic is, I mean, I get it. I up sticks and move about the world fairly randomly, or have done a few times, so I get the appeal. But I think you're right on that logic. I think the correct solution in his head at the time would have been magical journeys for sure. That really landed. I like that. Well, that's a good opportunity to kind of close out by talking about some of the cosmic implications, because we spoke about anarchy, but he actually says something that I'd like you to unpack for me, because I'm not sure if I've got it yet, but at the closing of book 1, or the first part anyway, of Heliogabalus, he sort of says, to have a sense of the profound unity of things is to have a sense of anarchy. And that's a much more benign view of it. But does he mean it in that scary sense, which is everything has to come down, or does he actually mean it in the more benign or positive, almost like agorist, decentral, anarchistic political sense? What's he going with a line like that, do you think?
As far as I understand it, Artaud's idea that if any situation contains anarchy, then it will bring things down. And so, yes, this moment at the first part of the book where he's announcing this, it's also a sense of as we were saying earlier, because it's a vocal experiment as well. There's a sense that you come to the first part of the book and you have to announce something, and so you often get this sense of a prophetic announcement of something which necessarily is going to become engulfing or apocalyptic at the end of a particular sequence of vocal improvisation. And so, as I said, it's there very often in Artaud's letters of that period and the next few years. Artaud's idea of magic is really something that fluctuates, very, very radically across his work. He's very preoccupied with magic in the final years of his life also. And one of his final projects is when he was mainly working on drawings. In the last years of his life, he focused on making drawings. And he has a project called 50 Drawings to Assassinate Magic.
I love it.
And this sense that he's still wielding his own magic, but that the magic around him has become so all-engulfing that he can only combat it through the medium of the drawing. Artaud's drawings are very, very violent drawings that often tear the page and that are full of implements of weaponry, of torture, and so on. And so he thought that to amass these drawings was a way in which he could combat this sense of a magic which is about to assassinate him. And this final period, he's very concerned with the sense that black magicians will send assassins to kill him at the end of his life. And his very, very final writings, he was working in notebook form at the last few nights of his life, are about this idea that black magicians are about to send assassins, and that he in his room in a convalescence clinic is about to be killed by these assassins, and so he has to create a combative magic to repel them, which he did through vocal experiments.
That is reading Heliogabalus as someone whose primary interest is magic, both in the doing and the history of it. It's fascinating, as you say. There's a list of books because there's really only 3 historical sources for this emperor, but he did spend all that time in the Bibliothèque Nationale reading astrology books and Near Eastern anthropology and other stuff. So it was the cutting edge of the sort of beginning of the 20th century's understanding of these things, which has moved on since then. But his analysis is someone who has a deep intuitive understanding of magic's at least psychological potency. Like there's something Lovecraftian when he talks about I actually wrote it down. It's enthralling to note that the older the cult, the more it shapes a terrible image of the gods, and that only their terrible aspect can make us understand the gods. Now that's true. That's like historically verified. You find that in the Bible. You go back to the beginning of the Old Testament, and God is crazy and terrifying and turning people into pillars of salt, and it's God is terrible because that is how you understand the magnitude of an idea like God. And so here's someone who was, in my estimation, like really doing magic and had a really ahead of his time understanding or deep reading between the anthropology of the implications of this Near Eastern sun god, and but I'm not surprised that by the end of his life that you get the combination of mental illness and drugs and getting old and so on, that it's a 50-50 mix of his own fantasy, but also like a possible philosophical doing of magic, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at this list of the books which he'd been reading while he was researching the book, and many of the books are about Assyrian magic. So he was really going far beyond the then published sources about Heliogabalus's own life, and I guess was searching very deeply in the published work, especially as I said from the beginning of the end of the 19th century, the first years of the 20th century, when it seems that in France there had been this this great preoccupation with exploring Assyrian magic.
Yeah, it's history. Well, empires get Put it this way: France was getting over its Egyptomania and had a new love interest in terms of how it would invent history, and it was the Near East, and that was certainly very popular for the European powers at the time. But I think he's right. Like, he wouldn't have had any evidence that he could point to for this to be correct. But it's the key to Heliogabalus' psychology is there in Homs when he was installed as the head of this like sun god, mountain god cult at about the age of 11 or 12, we may guess. And I think he's right to be digging in that direction to get at whatever this really, really unusual person in history, because it's in there, and it's in this alien, at least to him, cosmology, because he does, and it's a fairly anarchist thing to say, and also, I guess, correct. He makes it explicit in the book that Europe in the early 20th century is still the Roman Empire. Like, his point is, like, I'm telling this story because the empire is actually us, and he does it in a way that I think is foreshadowing post-colonialism, because he says it's the empire in the sense that we are still structurally in these morals that Heliogabalus as this Oriental came to wreck, and a big part of our fear is that outsideness of the empire. And I just that's what I mean. You read through Heliogabalus, I found remarkable, because you get this image of Artaud on what I think is a correct quest in the absence of actual data to do with this emperor kid's life. I think he went in the right direction. I'm not sure about you, but I think that would be the key to. That's a real actor's attitude to finding Heliogabalus in history, and I, in my estimation, I think he did that right. I'm not sure about you.
Yeah, it's also very interesting, because the book has, although it hasn't been translated into English before in its entirety, it has been translated into other languages, and it was an immensely influential book in Japan in the 1960s, where it was translated in I think about 1964, and was immediately taken up by Japan's experimental artists, filmmakers, and so on, dancers too. And so that sense of absorbing Artaud's conception of magic, conception of an insurgent form of power that dismantles a land which is passing into wasteland, something that really resonated a lot for Japanese artists at that time. 1934 is also the year, I guess, in which Stalin's death camps are really being formulated and put into practice, and so there's that sense too. Artaud has a score to settle with communism, because it's really the dispute over communism that jettisoned him from the surrealists. So there are all kinds of anarchistic obsessions and preoccupations with magic, the desire to do research, but at the same time to do it in a very intensive way, because he didn't research the book over a very long period of time. He looked at what he thought would be the essential sources, and then he took his capacity to improvise from them, from quite intensive reading.
Yeah.
So that sense of really a sensorial book that's launched across political cultures, historical cultures, magical cultures, but still has a great immediacy to it.
So that's, I think, where it feels so post-colonial, or at least de-imperial, because it's a history book that makes explicit the sort of power structures that build history books anyway, and him deciding not to do it. Like, there's three sources for Heliogabalus, and he's like, well, here's an anarchist history. Here's how you do it. Here's what a sometimes crazy theatre genius does when asked to do a history book, and it says something about himself and culture at the time, but also the politics of history, which isn't as spelled out as some of the other sort of obvious points, like Heliogabalus is about me and blah 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 in it, but it's there. Like, I think as someone who's been so interested in historiography and decolonial historiography, he was doing it without maybe well, certainly not having those words for it, and it's just it's amazing. I think he's done. I'm so glad that there is this translation in English out at the moment. I think it's an essential read.
Yeah, yes, because it has been translated into other languages, as I mentioned. It seems quite strange, or perhaps it's been waiting its moment.
See, it's funny you say that, because like that occurred to me when you gave the context for its popularity in Japan. You go, is this book a curse? Does this book show up at a moment? I mean, we have Brexit looming, and here comes Heliogabalus. This is interesting. I wonder if it's some sort of anarchist French Necronomicon or something.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's partly the practical matter that last year was the year that that Artaud's copyright expired, and so in a sense, anyone can get their hands on the book now. Anyone can translate or publish the book. So that itself has an almost anarchistic resonance to it, because Artaud's work was always very tightly controlled by his Catholic family after he had died, and many of his works were prevented from publication for what turned out to be 50 or 60 years, and so it's really a moment at which Artaud's work I guess will be seen in a different perspective, because so much of it now can be translated very, very easily, and is no longer under this culture of prohibition that it had been for the past decades.
Fascinating. It's interesting you talk about his death, because we should finish there. I love this line. He died a coward, yet in a state of open rebellion. And this is Artaud writing about Heliogabalus. And that open rebellion to the end, I think, fascinated him. Like he was he was the empire's anarchist to the very end, to not just his death, but as you say, he hides or tries to flee through a latrine and is attacked and dismembered and thrown in the river and so on. It's a state of open rebellion even in those posthumous moments.
Yes, Artaud is absolutely fascinated with Heliogabalus's death, and with especially this sense that someone who is extremely cowardly can still show a sense of their embeddedness within anarchism. Really at the last moment.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, Stephen, I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and obviously there will be links to where people can get the book and so on in the show notes. But a couple of questions, I guess, to leave people with. In addition to Heliogabalus, if this is the first time and they're hearing about Artaud now, what's like the easiest is the wrong word. What's the best first step way in? Like, what would people read after Heliogabalus? Because frankly, this is a good way in. This is a good first book. In a funny way, because you get a taste for his ideas, but you're actually reading this performative history book. But like, where should people go after that, or in addition to it, in your estimation, to get a sense of Artaud, maybe from a writing perspective?
One interesting way to approach it would be to look at the catalogue of Artaud's drawings that the Museum of Modern Art in New York published some years ago. Because Artaud's work, especially in the last 10 years of his life, which is some of really the most exciting work of Artaud, is really connected to the way in which he approached his artwork. And really, Artaud had lost interest completely in theatre by the time that he was released from the last of the psychiatric hospitals. And so the last 2 or 3 years of his life, he was focused primarily on drawings. And these drawings in recent years, have really had a lot of attention, and have been exhibited in art museums, in Europe, in the USA, and have really altered the way in which Artaud's work is perceived. So I think I would suggest having a look at Artaud's drawings and also the writings that he did on his drawings, which is one of his final preoccupations. Also, really at the end of Artaud's life, he made a radio recording, a radio broadcast called "To Have Done with the Judgment of God," which can be listened to on ubu.com and some other websites. And this was really Artaud in a state of terminal anger, terminal fury with these institutions. Also, it's also a work in which he discusses in some depth his approach to magic, or his own capacity for inflicting magic. And that radio recording was commissioned by the French national radio station, but then banned. Yeah. And so it all disappeared at the end of the 1940s. It was down to the last reel-to-reel copy, but it survived, and it's very vivid evidence of Artaud's work. It also has Artaud's screams, so there's the sense of having this very corporeal contact with Artaud's work, which otherwise is comes through different strata and through linguistic vocal strata, and it's very tangibly there in Artaud's recorded work. So that's really what I suggest, is listening to his radio recordings and taking a look at some of his drawings.
Excellent stuff. Well, Stephen, thank you very much for your time and for the context around this remarkable book and this remarkable person. I certainly enjoyed it. It was I've changed, obviously, in the last couple of decades since university. So this was, in some sense, a trip down memory lane, but another, wow, I missed a lot of this. Or maybe I wasn't ready for it. I don't know. But again, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. This has been a great chat.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gordon. Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Well, there you go. A really fascinating chat about a fascinating book that is kinda about a fascinating historical personage. Check out the show notes for details on where to get it and so on. And apologies for the delay in getting this one out. If you just subscribe to the podcast and don't follow the blog, you'll have missed the update. It's spring on the farm, which is busy enough. But the additional planning for both the Metaphysics of Desire workshop in New York and As Above in Portland, both of which still have a few tickets available at the time of recording, has been more than a little disruptive to, shall we say, normal programming. And actually, if you don't follow the blog, you'll have missed my other bit of exciting news, which is that I will be speaking at the Guggenheim in New York on Tuesday, September 10th. I think it's 6:30 p.m. start, with Dr. Diana Walsh-Pasulka. Details are on the blog or the Guggenheim website, obviously, which is where you get the tickets from, and probably all over my socials by the time this comes out. The event is called Technology and Habitat, and so we will be talking about magic and UFOs and animism and all that. So come along if you're in the area. Yes, please, very definitely. So that's the show for this week. Famous last words, but I think I have a handle on my schedule for the rest of the month until I leave. So hopefully no further disruptions. If there are, I promise I'll be more communicative. And as always, I will make up the episodes. So subscribe, follow, share, do the things. Until next time.